Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second Mary Bosanquet lecture. You may wonder why we're called Mary Bosanquet Lecture. Well, this is the reason. Mary Bosanquet Fletcher was born on the 12th of September 1739. She was an English preacher credited with persuading John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, to allow women to preach in public. She was born into an affluent family, but after converting to Methodism, rejected its luxurious life. She was involved in charity work throughout her life, operating a school and orphanage until her marriage to John Fletcher. She and a friend, Sarah Crosby, began preaching and leading meetings at her orphanage and became the most popular female preachers of their time. Mary was known as a mother in Israel, a Methodist term of honour for her work in spreading the denomination across England. It's our delight tonight to welcome Chine McDonald. Chine is director of Theos, the religion and society think tank, and previously was head of community fundraising and public engagement at Christian Aid. She is a regular contributor to Thought for the Day on Radio 4, the daily service and prayer for the day. She sits on a number of charity boards, including Greenbelt Festival and Christian Aid. Chine is an author who has written 2 books, God is Not a White Man, and Am I Beautiful, which can be found on the bookstall at the back. So welcome, Chine, and we look forward to hearing from you. This lecture is a gift to the Methodist and Church and beyond from Methodist women in Britain to encourage, enable and equip. And this lecture will be available on our YouTube channel via the Methodist Women in Britain website, along with our other events. So, welcome, Chine, and we look forward to what you have to tell us.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay at the back? I did a talk a few weeks ago at St Paul's Cathedral, in the bottom bit, the small bit, and I got through my 40-minute lecture, and then we had the Q&A, and the first person, a man put his hand up and he said, I didn't hear a word of what you said. So, if you don't hear me at any point, please put your hands up. I'm hoping this is, I'm going to move this away from my mouth a bit. So, it's a real honour to be with you this evening. Methodism runs strongly through my family in Nigeria, but also in my in-laws as well, and I'll get to that towards the end of my lecture. But the title of this talk today is Casting Down the Mighty, Women and the Mission of God. My foremothers called it Ogu Umuwanyi, the Women's War. The white men called it the Aba Riots, diminishing the women's roles in bringing about change and reducing their protest to the frenzied and irrational violence of savages. It took place in 1929 when thousands of Igbo women, including those from Umuahia, which is my ancestral home, protested against the British colonisers who wanted to restrict the role of Igbo women in the governing of their own communities. Now, the protests of 1929 spread like wildfire, as tens of thousands of women from across 6,000 square miles of southern Nigeria, an area covering around 2 million people, rose up in protest against the British, demanding that, and I quote, all white men should go to their own country. Knowing Igbo women as I do, people like my mum and my aunties, the descriptions of their modes of protest make me smile. Not with amusement, but with pride. These headstrong, fierce women were just like those within my own family. And they employed traditional methods of protest that only Igbo women could. Sitting on or making war on men whom they believed had been behaving badly. And this involved, as anthropologist Judith Van Allen describes, gathering at his compound at a previously agreed time, dancing, singing scurrilous songs that detailed the women's grievances against him, and often insulted him along the way by calling his manhood into question, banging on his hut. Banging on his hut. Can you hear me okay? Is that still? No, it's gone. The light is on, but it's not. I'll just use this for now, if that's okay. I'm not going to be able to take this off. So banging on his hut were the pestles women used for pounding yams, and in extreme cases, tearing up his hut, usually meaning pulling the roof off. The women would stay at his hut all night and day if necessary, until he repented and promised to mend his ways in the future. As has been so with the injustice experienced by black people throughout history, the actions of these Igbo women were met with disproportionate force. On 2 occasions, the British district officers called in the police and the troops, who fired upon the women, killing more than 50 of them and leaving another 50 wounded. Now, this was the first instance of a major anti-colonial protest by women in West Africa, and it resulted in the British abolishing the system of warrants chieftains and appointing women to the native courts. In this instance, these women were able to reclaim the positions of authority they had held before the colonizers came with their aggressive notions of the role of women in the functioning of a society. They tore down the mighty, and they did it in a way that was true to who they were as Igbo women. I'm going to be drawing on 2 passages of scripture this evening. One is from Luke 1, and I'll begin and then move on to a video so you won't have to hear my voice reciting it. But it's from a famous passage in the beginning of Luke. At that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, where she entered Zechariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favoured that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord will fulfill his promises to her."
My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Saviour, for he has looked with favour on the lowliness of his servant.
Surely, from now on, all generations will call me blessed.
For the Mighty One has done great things for me,
and holy is his name.
his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation.
He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts.
He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly.
He has filled the hungry with good things
And sent the rich away empty.
He has helped his servant Israel,
In remembrance of his mercy,
according to the promise he made to our ancestors, to Abraham, and to his descendants forever.
So that was a video I put together when I worked at Christian Aid because I thought there was power in women reciting these words. In them we hear Mary proclaim, "He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble." Or as other translations say, "He has cast down the mighty," just as the Igbo women who took on the colonial officers. So in our time together, I want to share just a few reflections on the ways in which women throughout history in the church and wider society, and today, have played their part in the mission of God, in bringing about the kingdom of God, in particular, a kingdom of justice. And as I thought about what we mean by the mission of God, I hope you'll forgive me for drawing on the Church of England's 5 marks of mission, which stated here, the mission of the church is the mission of Christ. And we can see this in these 5 marks of mission: to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptize, and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation, and sustain and renew the life of the earth. But it's this one that I want to focus on this evening: to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and pursue peace and reconciliation. To me, it's these unjust structures of society that are those mighty things that Mary sings about in her Magnificat, where we hear about casting down the mighty. In our time together, I want to say 5 things about how we might, as women, cast down the mighty. So first, we cast down the mighty even though no one expects us to. We cast down the mighty in solidarity with our sisters. We cast down the mighty in song. We cast down the mighty with prayer, petition, and persistency. And we cast down the mighty in our own everyday lives. So first, we cast down the mighty even though nobody expects us to. Now, this Magnificat that we are so familiar with is a song of revolution, sung by a woman, and yet it's been so sanitized. Oh, this woman has been underestimated, like so many women have throughout history. During my university years, as I explored different forms of worship to the conservative evangelical tradition in which I had been raised, I found my soul stirring to the words of the Magnificat as I sat in vast cathedrals and heard the voice of God in the Song of Mary. Now, though I found these moments extremely moving and felt the presence of God in the ethereal music, there was something I couldn't quite put my finger on that I found disturbing. Something uncomfortable, something out of place. As I've reflected on it, I've since worked out what it was. And it was that the words, these powerful words, did not quite match the settings in which we were singing them. The Magnificat speaks of the overturning of a world order. But there I was sitting in historic pews laced with gold and precious materials. Here the church would have been seen more as the mighty than the poor. In 1521, Martin Luther wrote a commentary on the Magnificat. And for someone who himself wasn't afraid of revolution and stirring things up a bit, it was odd that his reading of Mary's canticle is so different to those for whom it is a song of liberation. Instead, he was writing it for a young prince called John Frederick, who was the future elector of Saxony. And Luther aimed his handbook on the Magnificat at the leaders, demonstrating in his commentary the ways in which he thought the Magnificat showed that it was God who gave people power, including political office, and it was God who could take it away. Sure, that's one potential take. But as Catholic theologian Margaret Hebblethwaite told me, Luther missed the whole point and ignored the fact that it was a cry of political liberation, It was about revolution. It was about casting down the mighty, not propping them up on their thrones. That Mary's song is sung by a woman perhaps masks its power because of how women have been seen throughout centuries. Mary is sanitized in the choral music, which takes her words and makes them pretty rather than powerful. In the Magnificat, Mary is a prophet. She is powerful and eloquent. Whether or not she herself wrote the words or sang them or not, their attribution to her, to me, demonstrate the power of women. You may have seen this painting before, which is called Madonna del Magnificat, and it was painted by Sandro Botticelli in 1481. It's a really beautiful image, packed with vibrancy and colour. And we see Mary surrounded by the Christ child and 5 angels, 2 of whom are crowning her head. In the background, we see sky and a green landscape, giving the image both an earthly and a celestial feel. But the focus of this image is on Mary writing the words of the Magnificat in an open book. We see that her right hand takes ink from the inkwell being held by one of the angels, and her son is pointing at the words, seemingly guiding her hand. She also holds her son and a half-eaten pomegranate, and in Greek mythology, this fruit signifies the cycle of life and death in Christian art. It also came to symbolize the passion of Christ, his suffering and death and resurrection. Now, by the time this painting was created, viewers would have been used to seeing images of the Virgin Mary reading. But it was really rare to see her writing, because it was rare to see any women writing. It was thought to have been a deliberate decision, a statement that Botticelli wanted to make. A feminist statement about the power of women like you and me, or the opposite. Some think it may not have been a statement about the intellectual capabilities of women, but instead highlighted the impossibility of women being able to write, by highlighting Mary as the exception to the perceived lack of intellect of women. So here is Mary presented as a prophet who casts down the mighty, but what we're supposed to believe is that she is nothing like us. And this will not do, because we cast down the mighty in solidarity with our sisters. For much of the past 2 millennia, Mary of Nazareth has resembled her son, meek and mild, blonde and blue-eyed. Because patriarchy has long been dominant in Western society, she has also taken on the submissive stance of the women in whichever age she has found herself, quiet and submissive. This Mary is the self-sacrificial, unambitious, doting, ever gentle, loving, perfect mother. But there is another Mary, the Mary of the Magnificat as I read it. In this, the longest speech attributed to a woman in the whole Bible. Mary of Nazareth was no wallflower. If you peel back the layers of patriarchal construction, we find in the pages of history an extraordinary woman who gave birth to a movement that changed the world. If you look at some of the earliest Christian writings and drawings, we see a Mary who was very much a leader in her movement, empowered and freed from the misogynistic chains around her. And she wasn't just liberated herself, but she freed others. Early Christian writings described her as a defender of women. Demetrius, the 3rd century Archbishop of Antioch, is attributed to have said, "Hail Mary, through whom and by whom all the women in the world have acquired freedom of speech with her Lord." Ali Katush, who is another historian, quotes 4th century poet Ephraim the Syrian, who wrote, "In Mary there has come hope for the female sex. From the insults they have heard and the shame they have felt, she has given them freedom." In many ways, Mary of Nazareth was extraordinary. But what has drawn me, a black 21st century evangelically raised Protestant mother, to her is that this Mary reflects back the extraordinary nature of so many of the everyday women I see around me. And women through history have seen this too. They have seen in Mary an icon for their own liberation, and a paragon of womanhood that points towards a God whose arms are open to all. Now, these contradictions are why Mary has been both critiqued and hailed by feminist movements at different points in history. Victorian writers such as George Eliot and others rediscovered and to some extent reconstructed a religious tradition that harmonized with their feminist principles and promised the elevation and empowerment of women. For them, writes Kimberly Van Esveld Adams, the figure they used most often to represent those hopes was the Virgin Mother of Christianity, who became their lady of Victorian feminism. What might it look like if we unmade the version of Mary that has subjugated women and has had us trying and failing to live up to a perfect standard? What might it look like if we told a new story, if we heard a new song about Mary? Ursula King writes that it is time. Women need to create new images of Mary through new insights and interpretations of the life of Mary and her role in the liberation of human beings. Paintings, images, and interpretations of Mary still exist that reinforce her weakness as a woman, and as a consequence, the weak state of women everywhere. These images lead women to accept unjust systems because of their lowly positions. Women need to work together in creating new images that will liberate them to see Mary as a catalyst in the liberation of all women. These new images are indeed being created. And Mary is finding herself at the heart of liberation movements around the world, where the Magnificat is recognized as a song of freedom and about the casting down of oppressive regimes and structures. It is this Mary that has been an emblem, particularly within Latin American liberation theology, where she is seen as standing in solidarity with the oppressed, because she herself knew what it was to be poor. It is these lines in particular in the Magnificat in which those living in poverty or those who are marginalized can find hope, and the reason that Mary becomes the symbol of the struggle of the poor and marginalized. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent away empty. The Magnificat is not about maintaining the status quo, but is a woman's prophetic cry for a world that will be turned upside down. Reverend Lucy Winkett, who was the first female priest to join St. Paul's Cathedral many years ago, described how Mary turns us outwards. We're called as women and men to steady our gaze on the suffering of the world, as she steadied her gaze on her son. And reflecting on Mary's extraordinary declaration of the Basileia, the kingdom of God, Lucy Winkett recalled the testimony of Wahu Kara, a global social justice activist, as she stood on stage at St. Paul's Cathedral in 2005, alongside the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and the UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown, in front of 3,000 people. Lucy says, while everyone else quoted statistics and said that every 4 seconds a child died from poverty, she said she knew the faces of those people. These were her family and her neighbours, and it was a scandal that they were still poor. Like so many women, liberation for the oppressed was not just theoretical or political, but it was a necessity because she was on the front line of human experience, seeing the suffering of others up close. We see this so often through women's roles in caring for others, providing for their communities, their churches, seeing the need and doing something about it. We could all hear in her passion and courage the cadences of the Magnificat, Lucy Winkett said. God has filled the hungry with good things and has sent the rich away empty. They were her family and they were her neighbours. But we also cast down the mighty in song. Sometimes these new messages of liberation are forged in song, just as they are in Mary's Magnificat. She sings a song of liberation. There is something really powerful about singing, and we know that Methodism was born in song. Civil rights anthems such as We Shall Overcome strengthened activists during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Songs such as the 1897 hymn Nkosi Sikelel i Africa, which became the song of the anti-apartheid movement and South Africa's national anthem. Historian Beth Allison Barr, who wrote a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, reflects on the power of the patriotic hymn Jerusalem within the early 20th century fight for women's equality. In 1917, a year before some women in England were allowed to vote, the women of the Royal Albert Hall Choir performed at a service held to mark women's contribution to the Great War effort, with some having driven ambulances, been nurses, or part of the Land Army. And at the service, which was attended by Queen Mary, the choir sang the hymn, which comprised William Blake's hymn, and did those feet in ancient times. Beth Allison Barr writes that the following year it was sung at a suffrage demonstration, and that the song would become emblematic of women's perseverance in their fight for the vote. Standing at the Royal Albert Hall, she said, I could imagine the words echoing throughout the curved building, filtering beyond its walls and into the streets of London. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. In my own earliest months of motherhood, where I thought I had lost myself, I found solidarity and freedom in song, alongside a group of mothers in southeast London. The first time I walked into the community centre where the Hummy Mummies, a community choral group, met, it felt like heaven. There were babies crawling around on the floor, rolling around on playmats, being breastfed by their mums. There were babies crying. There were babies having their nappies changed. And then there were the mothers. They were free. And as I walked into the chaos, I exhaled, because here I didn't have to shush my baby or feel shame at not having it all together. Most wonderfully of all, here I got to sing with other women. Pop and rock classics that made us feel good, from Cyndi Lauper's True Colours to Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer. In her book, Why We Sing, Julia Hollander details Swedish singer and neuroscientist Björn Wickhoff's experiment, exploring the effects of social singing on the rhythms of the singers' hearts. It found that, even allowing for the variability in each individual's cardiac oscillations, they were sharing common patterns. In other words, singing together makes our hearts beat as one. Hollander describes this communal singing as like a murmuration, a collective of birds that flock together, swooping, swirling, and shape-shifting as one. It felt as though we were in our own version of a murmuration, she writes, with our hearts as the hub from the soles of our feet to the crowns of our heads, our blood all pumping in the same rhythm. Even if we didn't know it, our bodies must have felt that common beat through our skin, in our veins and our arteries. In the pulsing of our singing hearts, there must be some ancient survival instinct, not so different from the birds. When women sing together, it can make a difference. Writing about women's role in radical theology in the English Revolution in the 17th century, Dr. Sarah Apatry notes that women engaged in prophetic singing. She writes, spiritual singing was considered a manifestation of the new birth, like the Magnificat, the proclamation of the living Christ incarnate in the saints, and heaven's condescension to earth. With Mary, female prophets played a particular role as singing heralds of the kingdom of Christ, breaking forth within all humanity. A singing prophetess, she writes, was the herald of revolutionary change, not only in the world around her, but in herself. The sight of the living temple, where the songs of Zion could be sung anew. Speaking of the Magnificat, Mary's song, womanist Hebrew scholar Professor Will Gaffney notes that Mary professes faith in a God whose mercy transcends time and is not limited to her and those who see the world exactly as she sees it. She proclaims a God who is partial to the plight of the poor and is a terror to the tyrant. The song, the Magnificat, recalls an ancestral promise, and she bears witness in her very body to a God of promise. Mary's song joins with the prophetic singing of women in Scripture who had gone before. Lots of theologians have noted the similarities between Mary's Magnificat and Hannah's song in 1 Samuel. Some have suggested that Hannah's is a harbinger of Mary's, with both using their gratitude at their divinely ordained motherhood to sing praise to God and declare a coming kingdom that bears little resemblance to the unjust one in which they live. And the Magnificat itself is also a song addressed to another woman, Elizabeth. For Hannah and Elizabeth, their pregnancies follow years of infertility. Magnificat is a declaration for all humanity, but it's ultimately the song of women. I love this quote from a group of feminist theologians who said in 1994, "This song, the Magnificat, announces a complete change in the present patriarchal order. This means moral, social, political, economic, and cultural reversals. The woman who sings this song is a liberated woman, standing in the line of the strong women of Israel. There is great encouragement for women in the support and solidarity that women give to one another." We cast down the mighty with prayer, petition, and persistency. I want to bring in another passage, which is from Luke 18, the persistent widow. In this passage, we hear Jesus telling the parable of this persistent widow, a woman who wears down an unjust judge, who keeps on and keeps on demanding justice until he has no choice but to give it to her, concerned about what she might do to him if she doesn't get it. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, "In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, 'Grant me justice against my adversary.' For some time he refused. But finally he said to himself, 'Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" The Greek translation of the text sees the judge use dramatic hyperbole by employing the word hupopiazo, meaning to blacken the eye. While other translations treat the word as a euphemistic for wearing him out, it's important that we don't miss the intended sentiment, that the woman may be ready to inflict violence upon the unjust judge, such is the level of her grief. This is not a woman who lives a privileged life where she can afford to sanitize her anger, to act in a calm and measured way as society might expect of ladies. Now, this woman's life circumstances mean that her anger can't be contained. Her demand for justice, not merely relayed in quiet, polite, ladylike requests, but the kind of loud protest that hits you right between the eyes, that doesn't allow you to look away. Like the Igbo women who employ persistent collective action to achieve the justice they deserve, the widow doesn't let go until she has that justice. I wonder what justice she's seeking. The parable doesn't spell it out, doesn't spell out the details of the wrong that has been done to her, or who she is fighting for. But the word used for justice here may imply vengeance. Some wrong has been done to her and she demands it be made right. But why a widow? Now, we all know that throughout the Bible we see widows and orphans and immigrants spoken of as the most marginalized in society. By choosing a widow, Jesus is emphasizing the fact that in society's eyes, the odds are stacked against her. Like women of the time, she's seen as a second-class citizen just for being a woman, and she has no one to speak for her, which is why she's making demands of the judge alone. And it can be implied that this corrupt judge may have been corrupt due to the common practice of being bribed. But this widow doesn't have the means to bribe him. Instead, it's her persistence, her petitioning, her prayer that moves the judge to action. She attempts to cast down the mighty by appealing to her relationship with God. Dr. Will Gaffney again describes how the Luke 18 passage demonstrates the persistence and resourcefulness of women to, in womanist parlance, make a way out of no way and survive until they can thrive. There is something very particular about attempting to cast down the mighty from a position of oppression and disadvantage yourself. We know the famous quote from Malcolm X that black women are the mule of the world. I can think of 3 black women, not necessarily widows themselves, but those whose persistent campaigning and petitioning in the face of injustice and tragedy has moved mountains. People like Mina Smallman, Doreen Lawrence, and Mamie Till. Each mothers of brown-skinned people loved by God who were murdered. In the aftermath of their deaths, each mother sought to blacken the eye of the powers that be, to cast them down, demanding justice for their children. So Mina Smallman, who we see here, her daughters Bieber, Henry and Nicole Smallman were stabbed to death in a park in Brent in London in June 2020. Now, Mina also happened to be the first female black or minority ethnic archdeacon in the Church of England. She maintained that racism was what led to the police not doing enough to find the sisters after they had been reported missing, and racism that led to the horrific sharing of images of the dead sisters' bodies by police officers at the scene. When Mina Smallman was asked in a Guardian interview why she kept on, why she was persistent in her demand for justice, she quoted Emmeline Pankhurst on fighting for women's suffrage. "You have to make more noise than anybody else," she said. "You have to make yourself more obtrusive than anybody else. You have to fill all the papers more than anybody else. Like the persistent widow, Mina Smallman demands justice and commits to wearing down the powers that be until they give it to her. In 1955, 14-year-old African-American Emmett Till was abducted, tortured and murdered after being wrongly accused of winking at a white woman in a grocery store in Mississippi. And this is his mother here, Mamie Till. After viewing the brutalized body of her son, his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, decided to hold an open casket funeral in the hopes that when the world saw the violence committed against her son, that it would wake people out of the slumber of inaction on racial justice. "Let the people see what they did to my boy," she said. As images of Emmett Till's broken and mutilated body were featured in magazines, Mamie Till's prayer was that this injustice could not be ignored, that the authorities would be moved to make change so that nothing like this would ever happen again. And we know, of course, that Emmett Till was not the last black person murdered for the colour of their skin. And Doreen Lawrence here, who's in the bottom right. Now, I was 9 and living in Eltham in southeast London when her teenage son, Stephen, was killed not far from where I lived. Doreen Lawrence's name has become synonymous with the fight for racial justice in the UK. She's devoted her life to not just seeing the murders of her son brought to justice, but the police and the authorities held to account for the institutional racism that Stephen's murder highlighted. She knows that she can never give up, that she must be a thorn in their side. She leaves the authorities with no peace. These 3 black women, like the persistent widow, demanded justice in the face of tragedy. As black women, they knew full well that justice had not been a friend to black people. In the words of poet and activist Langston Hughes, that justice is a blind goddess, is a thing to which we black are wise. Her bandage hides 2 festering sores that once perhaps were eyes. Ultimately, Luke 18 can be seen as a lesson for us to never tire of praying to God for the justice, the likes of which we believe we will see in the kingdom of God. The picture painted in the words of the Magnificat. If the judge can be moved to grant the widow justice, how much more so will a God of justice be moved by our petitions? Your kingdom come, we demand. Your will be done, we pray. On earth as it is in heaven. We participate in the mission of God through relationship with God. We recognise, however, that though we might see glimpses of justice in this, the now and the not yet of the kingdom of God, God's ultimate justice will be seen in the coming of God's kingdom. But for most of us, this feels unsatisfactory. We join all the women who have attempted to cast down the mighty in asking, "How long, O Lord?" crying out for justice in the here and now. And finally, we cast down the mighty in our own everyday lives. These 6 pictures here are women who have cast down the mighty, who have faced all sorts of barriers and climbed mountains to declare the truth of God's just kingdom. As well as people like Mina Smallman and Doreen Lawrence and Mamie Till, there are, of course, many others. Sojourner Truth, who's on the bottom left, the 19th century American abolitionist and campaigner, who challenged the idea that women were less than men in the eyes of God, including famously in her speech, "Ain't I a woman?" Like Mary Bosanquet, who persuaded John Wesley to allow women to preach, there she is on the top left, and rejected her wealthy family background after she converted to Methodism. And in the top middle, like Alison McDonald, my late mother-in-law, who died in 2016. A Methodist woman like many of you, who committed her life to her community and her 5 children, who worked to bring justice as a family lawyer, who ran a Rainbows group in her local area of Bridlington in East Yorkshire. We might not get to fight the big fights of racism or violence and oppression or civil rights abuses. That is not what we're all called to do. But we can cast down the mighty in our own lives and our own communities. Sometimes our mountains might be sleep deprivation, like if you've got a 2-year-old, tiredness, exhaustion, our mammoth to-do lists. Sometimes our mountains are depression or boredom or fear about our family's futures. The mission of God speaks not just to our so-called spiritual lives or the life that is to come, but to the things that occupy our thoughts in the here and now. Christ came to bring life in all its fullness, and that means wholeness in every area of our lives. So may we be persistent in our cry for God's justice to come in the here and now, to those who are helpless, to those who are underrepresented, to those who are oppressed, who are victims of violence and abuse, to those who are marginalised in so many ways. May we come alongside those who stand alone, crying out for justice. As Martin Luther King said, echoing Amos 5:24, now is the time for justice to roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you.
We're going to have question and answer session now. I don't know how we're going to manage with one microphone. You don't know. Right. Where's Liz? Oh, you're there. Sorry. Liz is going to come round with the microphone and then hand it to Chine. Right. Who'd like to start with a question? Sorry, who'd like to start with a question? No? No?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for the talk that we have heard so far and the anticipated comments that you will make to the questions that are coming up. All right. Tonight has fulfilled a dream for me. My name's Sharon Harbottle. I'm really pleased to hear you as opposed to read you. And therefore it's been an honour tonight. I'm flamboyantly going to say that we have dealt with the isms, the racism, the sexism, LGBT plus and disability, etc. in the church and in society. But the insidious grip of the class structure in this country holds us in captivity, silent, deadly, unseen, but active, in saying who can or cannot do or be this or that according to their social class, education, literacy, or lack of. And the church as a whole, and the Methodist Church in particular, that originally supported the disadvantaged, is complicit in all of this within its structures. Perhaps the tearing down of the effects of the class system in this country, in the way it manifests itself, is one of the next calls from God for us to hear. I'd appreciate your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess all I want to say is amen to that. I think the class struggle has been it's deeply embedded in the history of this country, isn't it? It's not just something that can be unpicked because it goes back for centuries. For me, part of the problem is when the church as a whole comes to represent middle-class, university-educated people, and that, particularly in some denominations of the church, those are the people that take up the senior positions. Therefore, those are it is those people who create the structures and tell the stories and represent what the church is. And as was mentioned, I run Theos, the Religion and Society think tank, and we do a lot of research into religious trends. And for so many people, they don't think that the church is for them, because most people in the country obviously are not rich and not kind of middle upper class. So the church becomes something that is separate from them, and therefore God becomes something that is not for them. So I absolutely think that that class is one of those things that needs to be, well, the class divisions need to be torn down. And we see it in so many ways. We see it in our politics. If you look at how Angela Rayner is portrayed, because she just speaks like most people. You know, she speaks like a northerner, and you know, she's not posh. And that I've been really fascinated to see how the fear of that tells us something about what our nation is or who holds power. So yeah, I agree. It's a bit of a tricky one to tackle head on, because it's not as defined. I don't think class is as defined as race, obviously, or gender, or physical disability. But there are all sorts of ways in which we can signal everyone is included, people who sound different, people who come from different backgrounds. And the church can become a place that models that, but it will take some tearing down, I think.
Thank you, Chine. I just listened to your book, finished it a few days ago. I found it very challenging, obviously with the subject material, but also very hopeful in how you concluded it. And so I'm thinking, although we may think that we've acquitted with the schisms of all of them, we still have a long way to go with women in the world where we're still marginalised and oppressed. I just want to ask you, where do you see the hope for us in the future?
So it's kind of a funny one, because I see hope in a lot of my people my age and younger, women my age and younger, who might have grown up in church, but basically can't stand patriarchy and misogyny, and so therefore they leave the church. And they might still describe themselves as Christian, might still pray, might still love Jesus, but the church itself has become this this structure that is not for them, and you know, that they oppose. So weirdly, I find hope in the protest of that, the fact that they are leaving, and leaving vocally, because I think ultimately the church has to pay attention. Some of the hope in my book, God is Not a White Man, is trying to show church leaders, predominantly white church leaders, that this is actually it's a missional question. It's not just a woke issue. It's if there is to be a future of the church in this country, then we can't be operating in the way that we have so far. So I find hope in young women, but I've spent some time with some of you this afternoon, and I've been really inspired by the passion for justice. The way that Methodist Women in Britain does a lot of stuff, really busy. I think it was joked that people assume that you kind of sit around and do knitting and things like that. So I have hope in, it's not just the younger people I have hope in, it's the women who are quietly kind of getting on with tearing down these structures of injustice from the places in which they are. I just want everyone else to pay attention to that. So to highlight those things and to show the power of women. So yeah, I have hope in women generally, older women and younger women.
Anyone else? Sorry. Sorry. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this evening. It's been a real pleasure to be able to be here. This is still a question which is kind of forming in my head, so you'll have to excuse its kind of fuzziness around the edges. But something about what if these words had been said by the other Mary, by Mary Magdalene, you know, the epitome of the fallen woman, as opposed to the epitome of perfect, you know, kind of wonderfulness that the Blessed Virgin is. Do you think that the church and society would find it more or less difficult to hear the challenge to the injustice if Mary Maggs had said it rather than the Blessed Virgin?
Yeah, it's handy. There's a bit of a walk, so I can try and have a few seconds. That is such a good question. My instinct is that it would have been probably wouldn't have even been in there. Like, it just wouldn't have made it through. But I would say that also Mary Magdalene has, what she has become has been kind of post the Bible and kind of patriarchal cultures, and this idea of the fallen woman and women being, you know. But there's also a part of me that thinks it might have sounded more obviously in her tone, like an outsider critiquing the structures and the culture as it is, because she is not one of us. Yeah. So there's something about that. But as I said at the start, I think even though it is the perfect Virgin Mary who said it, I think it has been so ignored anyway. I think any woman, all women are underestimated, ignored, or sanitized, or their words kind of prettified, which is why I have come to love it much more in recent years, and how Magnificat is becoming this much more recognised as this kind of liberation theology, feminist theology kind of anthem. So that's such a tricky question. But I think, yeah, no, I think it's, yeah, thank you. I think it almost doesn't matter what kind of woman you are, because whatever kind of woman you are, it's wrong. So, yeah, that's another reason why our voices are not heard.
I belong to the Hymn Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and in a few weeks I'll be going down to their conference in St Albans, and during those 4 days there will be 2 or 3 sessions run by people who aren't hymn writers, encouraging people and showing people how to write the modern hymns of today. What message would you like me to take from you you mentioned about the singing and the protest songs. What kind of themes, what kind of hymns do you think would be helpful for the coming generations?
If you've read my book, you'll know that I was a strange child who used to sit, when I was about 7 or 8, I used to sit in my room and sing through the songs and hymns of fellowship, and also loved a bit of Graham Kendrick in my younger years. So, but my love of those kinds of very white Western forms of singing, at some point in my kind of later years, I realised that it didn't represent me or my relationship with God or my view of the world, the sounds of it, the words. So I think what I'd say to modern hymn writers is that hymns, communal singing, songs to God, don't have to just sound like Britain or British songs or Western music. I also write in the book about how I sang an Igbo song a cappella at St. Paul's Cathedral in front of 800 people because I wanted to almost like pierce the sound of whiteness and colonialism through singing in my own native language, a song called Imela, which is a kind of song of praise to God in Igbo. So I'd say kind of, I'd love some new forms of worship that take in lots of different cultural sounds. But some of the kind of popular hymns that are being written, I'm trying to remember the group. It's like Sanctuary Songs, and there's another one, a group of kind of American worship writers. And what I notice in their songs is this idea that this truth-telling about life not being perfect, about pain, much more psalm-like in their kind of the words, but they all say things like, we don't have the answers, or I don't, I doubt, or, whatever it is. It just kind of the truth that I think is fitting of this generation, where you can't pretend. You can't pretend that everything is shiny. You can't pretend that your relationship with God is perfect. So, yeah, new music should represent different cultural sounds, but also should be more honest and authentic about the human experience in all of its kind of texture, I think.
Any more hands? Any more? Yes?
Sorry, my daughter fits the criteria you said of someone who has walked away from church, an incredibly strong faith. And there's nothing I like more than when I'm preparing like this Sunday for a service, and we'll go through the passage together. And she inevitably brings a truth and a simplicity to it that I wish I'd spotted, but don't. I think for me, I'm going home to her this evening, and it's what message, because looking at us all, we're all a lot older. What message would you like me to give her? As someone who is out of the church, loves God desperately, and found her faith whilst being bullied for autism and dyslexia in school, whilst on holiday, whilst away in Malawi. That's where the aunties took to her, and she turned from being beaten to a real warrior. What would you like to say to her? Because I want to give her a message back to encourage her to find, yeah.
I think that, controversially, I think it might be okay to not be in church for a little while, but kind of think that you might return at some point. And for me, I think it's really important to find communities of women in particular. This is where I find where the people that I pray with, speak about God most with, are not people in my church. They are, in particular, they're a group called the Mighty Women of Valor. A group of my friends, similar ages, on WhatsApp. That is where we do our faith. And we're all in different places. We don't all go to church on a Sunday. Some of us are vicars, but some of us aren't. Where I find myself able to live out my faith most authentically, or express doubt and fear or anxiety and hope, is in communities of women. So I would say, please find, it doesn't have to be women, but please find people who you trust and love, who might also love God, but might not be in church. I think it's important to find relationship in whatever that looks like, especially for young people today. There's other ways of doing relationship. Online is okay too. But maybe try and come back to an embodied community at some point.
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name's Stephen Cooper. I'm the Connectional Ecumenical Officer for the Methodist Church. And in the context of my work, I find Mary a very particularly fascinating figure in the context of our relationships as a Methodist Church with the Catholic Church. Obviously, over the centuries, the Catholic Church has sort of tended to kind of claim the ground when it comes to making much of Mary as a figure in Christian discourse, and in a way that has tended to major on this very sort of sanitized, spiritualized idea of and cult of Mary, in a way that has tended to cause Mary to be seen as a kind of Catholic thing that has made Protestants tend to shy away from an interest in Mary. And I really love the way that you have articulated this notion of reclaiming a proper concern for Mary from a different Protestant evangelical perspective, in a way which I think would find a great deal of resonance among Methodists, and gives me hope that there is the potential for greater common ground to be found between Methodists and Catholics around the significance of Mary than perhaps is often recognised. And so my question is really simply, have you had occasion to share the kind of perspective on Mary that you've shared today with Catholic audiences? And have you found it resonating with Catholic audiences in any way?
I should have said that my next book is out next February, and it's called, well, it's a working title. It's called Unmaking Mary, The Myth of Divine Motherhood. And it is all about, basically this, I guess it's a memoir of motherhood through the lens of exploring Mary. And you're absolutely right. I pretty much have ignored Mary most of my life. When I was growing up in evangelical churches, the only times I heard about Mary, it went along with, she said yes, she did what she was told, like, any good woman. And I mean, that's not that exciting to me. So I kind of just ignored her. So in the process of writing my book and thinking about motherhood in particular, and the, I guess, the symbols of motherhood, the archetypes of the Institute of Motherhood, I think of Mary as representing that. But through that journey, I have discovered, I had lots of conversations with Catholics, including Margaret Hebblethwaite, who wrote Motherhood and God. We sat at the British Library and just kind of talked about Mary. We kind of shared kind of other books that we'd read, either by Catholic theologians and sociologists or by Protestant ones. There is so much out there and so much reflection on Mary that has come from Protestant traditions over the past 50 years or so. Almost Protestants rediscovering Mary in this way that I have, which is, oh, she's pretty interesting. But when I have conversations with Catholics, it's almost like I'm saying, Mary's pretty good, isn't she? Like, she's pretty interesting. And they're like, yes, we know. Well done. But there is definitely like an ownership of her and a pride in Mary as part of this Catholic tradition. And I've learned so much We've got some Catholics in our team who I'm constantly asking questions about Mary with and having these conversations. And there is a pride at almost like, yeah, welcome to the not the cult of Mary. I think that goes a bit too far, but there's a lot of cult of Mary that has gone on over the past couple of millennia. But yes, I've had lots of conversations with Catholics. I think it is an area that can unite and provide kind of a space of conversation, not just about Mary herself, but about the nature of God, what the mission of God is, and who we are as men and women, as people called to kind of cast down the mighty. So yeah, lots and lots of conversations. I think it's a really interesting space. Obviously, I've written about 100,000 words on it, so I'm kind of excited by it.
You spoke a lot about these powerful women overthrowing systems and fighting for change. And I'm aware of the day-to-day challenges that living in that way and working in that way can bring. And I wondered if you could speak a bit about the maintenance of that passion and how you can continue in this kind of work longer term, knowing all the challenges that are faced kind of regularly in that.
Thank you also for tonight and for your book. I've read it and talked about it a lot with other people, and I find I get more resistance to the idea that God is not a man than that God is not white. So we may be moving somewhere. I think it was back in the 90s that the Methodist Church made headline news for including a prayer in our worship book which addresses God as Father and Mother. I'm not sure that we've come on very far in the 30 years in terms of our language about God, gendered language about God. And I just wondered how important you feel that is in the whole campaign, and how we make changes in how we think of and address and talk about God.
Okay, so how do you keep up the fight, I guess? Honestly, I think the wise thing to say is that you cannot do it forever, and you cannot keep it up forever with intensity. So part of what I'm learning, or part of what I'm hearing that I should do, is to engage in self-care, take breaks. The world can be very, very overwhelming if you start to think about all the problems that there are that we need to fix. And I think women often carry this a lot, I do, in my head, and it can become debilitating. So what I try to say to people is, think about, that's why I tried to end with, it doesn't have to be the kind of, engaging in the massive issues. What are the small things that I can do where I can see change that is manageable, and in order to sustain that that level of, I guess, engagement and passion with wanting to bring about change. For some people, it is the big things, right? But I think even for those people, there is burnout. There is tiredness and fatigue. I saw the Hopeful Activist book at the back, and I know a lot of people who, I think I've been on the podcast version of that, and people trying to say, for those who are activists who want to make change, you also need to engage in self-care, and you need to stop for a bit sometimes. You need to let things go, and that is not about kind of giving up, but recognizing what is in our power and what isn't. So all sorts of kind of practices that I think we need to put in place for ourselves to be disciplined about how we engage in the world, because we're not going to be any good to anyone if we're just kind of burnt out, lying in a heap on the floor. So I'd say that. Gender. So interestingly, yeah, my book is called God is Not a White Man. It is actually about gender as well. But I think because I've written it, people think it's like, no, just about race. It is also about gender. And I talk about in the book how I personally, I think I got halfway through writing the book and decided for myself that I had to take out all the male pronouns, and that I wanted to myself no longer use male pronouns for talking about God. It's very annoying sometimes and awkward, and you have to kind of think about sentence construction, but it's about making the effort in order to bring about change. One of the things I love about Methodists is that you seem to be very progressive. So that I've spoken at various Methodist conferences and events where it's like, we were doing the different ethnicities of Jesus many, many years ago. And it must feel like, well, why are we still talking about this? Because it's massive. We're trying to unpick centuries of having thought about God in a certain way, or having seen God in a certain way. So I think, even though these things feel small, like me or individuals, some of us not using male language, I think it has effects for those who come after us, who might, because of what we've done and the decisions we've made, just think it's normal. So I think about my 6-year-old who, despite knowing that I've written a book called God is Not a White Man, we're in the car one day and he was talking about, him and his dad were talking about God, and he was saying he this and he that, and I said, what makes you think God is a he? And he said, because God is a boy's name. I was like, oh no, where to start? So it's a bit tricky, and it's fascinating to see how much things can be picked up that don't come from my house. Any more questions?
Thank you. Sorry, it's not really a question, but I just wanted to add another. Again, I think about a 6-year-old who lived next door to us, who was in the school that I went to do assemblies in. She said to her mum one day, "Mummy, God's a man, isn't he? And that means boys are more important than girls." And I just want to share that just as the encouragement of just how important it is to keep on keeping on.
Hello, thank you for your talk today. I was wondering, do you have any ideas about how we can encourage women to find their voice? I'm thinking of my church, which is it's quite mixed culturally, but women tend to be very quiet. I'm a local preacher, but I'd like to encourage women to start giving more testimony, perhaps, and eventually preaching. Are there anything you can suggest that to encourage women to step forward?
Is what you're saying that people from kind of ethnic minority cultures might not be as forthcoming, women from those cultures might not be as forthcoming in speaking from the front? Is that the kind of, or any culture? So this is a very complicated question, isn't it? Because sometimes if you are a visible minority in a congregation and you come to church and you just want to hide at the back, you don't really want to be asked to do anything, sometimes we get excited, like, and we think, oh yes, great, this person can, we can invite them to kind of speak more or whatever. Sometimes that person might not be ready, but I think it's important to maybe ask or build relationships so that you can get to know what they might be ready for or be up for or not. The other element is that I hope the black and brown people in the audience won't mind me saying this, but I think that there is an ingrained inferiority among some, I can speak for black cultures or black and brown cultures, because of centuries of white supremacy and colonialism that have said to us that we are not supposed to be out the front, actually, or we're not supposed to hold positions of power. So that takes a lot of unpacking and unpicking. That Bob Marley song, "Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery." There's some mental slavery going on. And it's not going to be fixed by a white person asking people to come up the front. What I do think does help is seeing other examples like you who have gone first. Now, those might be from people from other churches or sharing videos of other people who might be from a visible minority in some way, because that sends the message that, well, if they can do it, then maybe I can. The problem is someone's got to go first, right? And I'm kind of aware that I do a lot of this stuff, right? I'm used to it, but I hope that in some way those people who might look like me or not be in the in-group of the kind of power might think, okay, well, if she can do it, then I can. So it's about finding those examples, but they might not necessarily come from the church itself. They need to be able to see the examples.
Any more questions? Then I'm going to hand over to Maggie to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much. Chine, it's an absolute delight to say thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's an absolute delight to say thank you. We've had a wonderful, wonderful evening. Oh, sorry. It's been so interesting to be inspired by what you say. Certainly opening up the Magnificat for us. I think you've inspired us and challenged us in equal measure, and that has been fascinating. And I think the one thing possibly that I certainly will take from this evening is that whatever we are involved in, whether it's community singing or challenging injustice, you've encouraged us and inspired us to go out there and make a noise. So thank you very much, and please accept this gift on behalf of Methodist Women in Britain. Before we go, I have one more little job to do, if you'll bear with me. This evening, we also want to say a big thank you to Ruth Parrott, who has been 3 different roles within Methodist Women in Britain: Vice President, and then President, and then Co-Chair, and she's stepping down in August, and we're all going to miss her terribly. Ruth has steered the ship, if you like, of Methodist Women in Britain, and to be fair to Ruth, I have to say it hasn't always been smooth sailing. We've also hit some choppy waters at times, but Ruth's calmness and her attention to detail has seen us through, and we are really going to miss her. So I do hope, Ruth, that you will enjoy family time, tending your garden, especially your hanging baskets, I believe. But thank you very much, and please accept this on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I say thank you very much? I don't know what's in there, but I will have a look. It's just been an honour and a privilege to be, well, I don't know what to say really, Vice President, President and Co-Chair. It's been a challenging time. 3 weeks after I was appointed, COVID came, and we had to learn all sorts of different skills. We had to keep the ship going on the water. I've had a wonderful time. I've visited up and down the country. I've been to places I'd never dreamed of. I've been to Colombia. I've been over to Ireland. I've been to the Isle of Man, and it has been wonderful. But the most wonderful thing, I think, is to be meeting all these wonderful women. Women who are the backbone of the church. And it's been a pleasure to meet you all and to make new friends. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. It's been a really good evening, and thank you again to Chine. It's been really brilliant. Thank you. So, did you want to say anything?
Okay. I've been requested to say that I will sign some books at the back. I wasn't expecting to sing, but I will just sing a thank you to Ruth, because Imela means thank you. So I'll sing that, and then we'll clap and then we'll go, because I won't know how to end it. Imela, Imela, o kaka, Imela, Imela is in